continuing and not jumping, and we've been here forever, and we're going to be here for a bit. But I've told you guys the next couple sections of Matthew are going to be fun as we're moving into portions where Jesus gives prophetic statements. And I want to say right up front, I've waded through how to preach these passages. There's just a lot of variety of interpretations among good Christian scholars who love the Bible, love Jesus, love the gospel. And one of the things I like about our denomination is we don't actually take a formal stance on the end times. We affirm Jesus is coming back, and then after that, we don't have a stance. We've always said this is something we think good Christians can have different views and walk together on. And we do. I know full well among some of the pastors that I get along with the most, we have different views. When we still had Bruce here, and Bruce, Abe, and I would be talking about our joint services, it was our ongoing joke. All three of us had different end times views. And so every time I was like, well, you're preaching next? Okay, well, then you have to do end times. No, I'm saving that for when you're preaching next. And there was no animosity. And there was no concern. Like, we were actually, as much as it was joking, there was a sincerity there. We were fine if Bruce wanted to get up and hit on one of those passages and share how he reads it. We were fine if Abe gets up the next one and shares a different view on the exact same passage. And fine if I come up to mop up after both of them. Because, I mean, if you don't think Jesus is coming back, that's going to make a mess of things. And really at that point you're departing from historic Christianity. But historic Christianity has always had good arguments on this. There's never been a consensus among Christians on the end times. There might have been some leanings in certain ways, but you could always find an outlier, someone else going, but what about? So I'm going to walk you through this. I waded through how to preach these passages. My first thought was to try and preach all the views, give you the survey. And I realized that's going to be a train wreck of sermons that go way too long. So I'm just going to teach you how I read these passages. And I just want to open by saying, I'm really, really okay if I don't convince you. Because the point I'm hoping to make is that the main teaching points, in other words, the practical applications, I think we'll all agree on. Even if the historical events we move around. I think this refers to that and not this. Either way, the point of those events will carry through. And so if as we jump into the first one where I know I'm going to take a side, if you don't agree with how I read it, just check me at the end if you don't agree with all of my points from it, because I think you will. And so we'll go through. And I hope that if you hear a view you didn't hold before, it just stirs you to dig a little deeper and read a little more. And if you still disagree with me, just hope that you end up learning how to disagree with me better than you did before. I'm totally fine with that. So we're going to jump in. So as we get into this one, we're talking the Vindicated mission. And I'll open this way. I like magic tricks. I like card tricks. Not because I'm good at them. I know about 2 good card tricks that I can do. I just like watching them. I like watching the videos of them, see if I can figure out. Because there's always something going on that you're trying to figure out. And of the 2 that I do, my favorite one is one where it looks like I mess up. I know I just ruined it if you have me do it for you later, because now you know I'm going to mess up and you won't believe it. But it's fun because for a moment it looks like everything's gone wrong. We started off in this trick and then the card's lost and I can't find it. And and this moment of weakness is the fun of it. And then suddenly you realize, nope, I had the thing working the whole time, and it all comes together and you see the answer at the end. It sorts itself out. And you have this moment of revelation. Oh, he didn't lose the card. Oh, he did know what he was doing. And so despite how it looked for a little bit there, everything was under control. Now, I'm not an impressive card magician. I don't know many of them. But I think there's something of this revelation of power or control that fits with where we're going in our passage today. Because Jesus came in weakness. He deliberately did. He allowed himself to be beaten, to be crucified. And he didn't do it as a trick. He was never bluffing in there going, he was straight up and honest the whole time going, I have authority that I'm just not using. But you can understand where people watching this go down would wonder for a little bit. And they did. You see that in the Gospels. I mean, he shows up, he preaches authoritatively, we've got these cool miracles, and then he just gets mocked by the religious leaders and the Roman officials, and and in that moment, you see people wrestle. They feel like the thing's not working. They wonder for a little bit there. But then there's the flourish at the end. Like the trick when the card comes back out and you realize, no, it looked weak, but it wasn't. The tomb's empty. More than that. As Jesus, and this is where we are in Matthew, is he's nearing his death. This is the last preaching series before his arrest and death. He lays out prophecies, and these prophecies defy the powers and authorities of their day. He says, the people that are going to turn me over and betray me, and the people that understand, even though it may look like they're winning, I'm going to sit here in advance and tell you that their powers will be shaken and broken and removed. And so they kill him, and then he comes back, and his words come true. It's a revelation moment. This was never out of his control. The weakness was voluntary submission. Don't doubt his power for a moment. It might look weak for a moment, but it comes out, and he's been in control the whole time. That's today's passage. It's the vindicated mission. Jesus has been given power and dominion over the whole world, and he sends out his gospel message in that power. We are to boldly and obediently call people to Jesus. That's the main point today. That's why I said, I think, regardless of your end times views, I think everything on this slide here, you're going to go, well, amen. I just think that this prophecy was a vindication of Jesus' power and authority. And it just underlines the fact that we are in a season where Jesus is powerfully and authoritatively sending out a gospel mission to the ends of the earth. All right? So that's where I'm going. Now let me read the passage and make you go, how on earth did you get there? Here's our passage. Matthew 24, jumping in at verse 15. We just had a series where we talked about warnings that could distract you from the mission. Now we're moving in to what's probably his first dream, where he's directly answering the questions that started this whole flow in Matthew 14, or 24. So verse 15, he says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back and take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not has been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. And if they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gate. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. All right, so that's a lot. And your mind probably jumped all over the place. I mean, how do you make sense of a passage like this with so much imagery, so many different... I mean, we've got a desolation that's spoken of in Daniel, so we've got references to Old Testament prophecy. You've got this analogy of a fig tree starting to grow. You got this apocalyptic language of the sun and the moon being darkened and stars falling from the sky, which he links to shakings of realities in heaven. It's a lot to take in. How do you interpret a passage like this? Well, one, you put all the prefaces I put at the beginning of this message, and you say, hey, I'm shaky territory here. This is what we would call unclear parts of the Bible. You don't get dogmatic and divisive on unclear stuff. But you've heard me say before, because I always say it wrong on my slides, we interpret the unclear by the clear. I think every time I put that on a PowerPoint slide, I've said we interpret the clear by the unclear, which is not what you do. But it's funny, we often do that with end time stuff. We'll take the weird parts of it and we'll get really particular about that and then argue about the stuff that was a little clearer. And so I want to argue, when I come to a passage like this, I start with the stuff that, and this is my own biases, what seems clear to me. And I try to lay those down as kind of anchors and then work through the rest from there. Knowing that I might not be able to figure it all out, and that's okay. So you're not going to get an exhaustive interpretation. I'm not even sure it's right to do them. But you can throw the next slide. We got pictures of a bunch of the different random elements in here. And I'm just going to walk through how I read the text and how I'm taking it. I recommend, as you've seen me do in many texts, that we look at the beginning and the end to kind of mark out where we are. I feel like there's some strong, clear statements in this text that, for me, push the way I read it. Verse 34 shouldn't be a complicated verse. If the rest wasn't so weird, you would take it at face value every time. He says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. To me, that's a clear statement. And it wouldn't be hard if it wasn't for everything he just said is so weird. We struggle to wonder if it all could fit in that generation. But the most natural way to read it to me is that this generation refers to the generation contemporary to the apostles. Others do take this in ways of saying maybe that generation refers to the church age and that we don't move into the next age, and that would give you a lot more time to play with on these prophecies. I take the short view, and then I work from there because that seems most natural to flow. I do that also because you remember back in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 24, the conversation started with the disciples walking through the temple grounds, looking at the buildings, and they're impressed by them, and Jesus says, don't be impressed by those buildings. Not one stone is going to be left on top of each other. And they ask, well, what's the sign and when will this happen? So they've been asking about that, and it seems like we have a fairly clear answer to that. He says, yeah, that destruction of the temple that I just told you is going to happen in verse 2. I've now explained in maybe some weird apocalyptic ways, but I'm saying your generation will see this. And so to me, I start there going, that seems to be clear. Can it work? Can it fit? I take the position that, yeah, I think it does. I think he's referring to a historical event that happens in their lifetime, which would be the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 A.D. We know that it does get destroyed in their lifetime. And that's what's, for me, ultimately the most persuasive thing of this. If we're talking about a destruction of a temple and one happens in their lifetime, it just feels very hard to interpret this passage any other way. Now, we pause here. I think reading just in Matthew, I can make this, and Matthew and Daniel, because he referenced it. The hard part comes when you jump to some of the other, if you go into Revelation, you go over to 2 Thessalonians, you have a little more hard time wrestling with the Jerusalem temple. And I just go, I don't know if those passages were talking about the same thing. I'm not saying that because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that God's judgment can't work in similar ways again in the future, because when I look in Scripture, God moves in judgment many times, and they do have similar shapes to them. So even though I think this event is talking about a past tense judgment of God, I have no problem saying if it turns out at the final judgment that some of it plays out similar, that wouldn't shock me one bit. But I think Matthew's gospel, read from the clear, is talking about an event that happens in their lifetime, and I think the Jerusalem temple fits it. I think that for a number of reasons. As I said, the opening and closing take us there, but also some of the details, I think, fit when I look for that. He talks about a desolation that will happen in the holy place in verse 15. Now, I think any Jewish person hearing holy place will think temple. And so to try and make it apply to something else, to me, feels like a stretch. But even more than that, the word, the abomination that causes desolation, that wording is similar to Daniel 7, and I think that's the background passage. But it's not identical to the Daniel 7. It's actually closer to a place in Maccabees when they talk about a previous desolation of the temple that happened in that period. It was a time when some of the Jewish folks actually thought maybe that was the fulfillment of Daniel. So one, this is not new. This happens to the temple, apparently. But two, it just, when they hear desolation, abomination, holy place, every guy present, to my mind, would think he's talking about the temple and its coming destruction, and a destruction that will be done by pagan people. And so he addresses that there's a coming desolation, abomination in the temple, and that his warning to them is that they shouldn't try to defend it or prevent it, but when they see that going down, they should run. Run quickly. Verses 16 to 20 are all about, when you see this happening, get out of Dodge. Leave Jerusalem, head to the hills. And so that's the picture he's painting. And at the end of the fleeing, we get this language where he paints a picture of vultures or eagles circling a corpse, verse 28. And so I think it just reads naturally to take this as talking about the temple, the holy place, being destroyed. Both verse 2, where we started, and verse 34 seem to clearly state that this generation of the disciples would live to see what Jesus is talking about. This isn't a sermon that he spoke to crowds or to other people. It's just to the disciples, so I think that limits us here. And so in this sense, I think that they, or their generation anyway, will live to see what Jesus is describing. That, so I'm repeating. That doesn't mean there couldn't be other similar events. But to me, it's just hard to pull this prophecy in the context of Matthew away from being something happening in their time. Especially, I say, we know the temple does get destroyed, but also, if you remember, the previous 14 verses, and included here in verses 16 to 20, were these warnings saying, now, there are things you might think is this, and they're not, right? He's like, I'm telling you an event that's coming, but you might think that it's already here when you see wars, but don't worry, there will be wars and rumors of wars, and there will be famines and persecutions, and there will be false messiahs, and none of those things tell you that we're here yet. If he spends all this time warning about signs that they might think, oh, this is it. No, it's not. But he doesn't say, oh, and by the way, there actually will be this one destruction of the temple, and that's not the one I'm talking. That would be a more striking sign of the destruction of the temple than all the other stuff he said. And if he gives them all these other warnings so they know in advance and doesn't mention that the temple will be destroyed in 70 AD, I mean, just the whole flow of the passage makes no sense at that point, which is why I go, if this wasn't what he's talking about, he really would have needed to say so. Because I think Jesus knows full well the temple will be destroyed. I don't think that's a surprise to him. He's coming and making a prophetic statement. So these are the things where I go, the flow of it, this picture, I can see as a picture of a destroyed temple. The lack of any warning not to take it as 70 AD makes sense that this is it. Jesus was talking about it, and if he wasn't, he would have indicated. All those other things are not signs that this prophesied destruction of the temple was at hand, but he never says there will even be this other destruction. So either Jesus was indeed prophesying the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or we have to explain why he skips the most important warning that generation would have needed. And I think it's more compelling just from the text to take these statements at face value and say, this is the 70 AD event that Jesus is talking about. And to take that as the clear parts and then say, okay, if that's so, then these other weird things he says, is it possible they fit? And I'll admit, these other statements are so expressive, sometimes symbolic or apocalyptic, that they're slippery to fit in. And so I can give you, here's how I see some of them, and to me that wouldn't even have to be compelling, and I'm still sold on this view. But I'd like to suggest that the whole section we just read is really just talking about that one event, the destruction of the temple, and it's just talking about it from different angles. And so I'm saying the destruction of the temple is the event where an abomination of desolation comes in the holy place, where Eagles circle a corpse while Christians flee. It's also a period of great tribulation that could be described with language like the sun and moon going dark and stars falling from the sky. And I'm going to say and argue even that it can be described as the sign of the Son of Man, fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel 7 and appearing before the Ancient of Days, appearing in power in the clouds, sending out messengers to the four corners of the earth. That is to say, in as simple terms as I can, that the destruction of the Jerusalem temple was a sign that Jesus had fulfilled all that the temple represented, and that the whole spiritual and social world was being shaken and reoriented in the most dramatic way in all of history, and reoriented around the power and authority of Jesus. That the risen and ascended Jesus was indeed seated beside the Father Almighty and taking his mission global, toppling the former powers and authorities of pagan lands. Those authorities are the stars that are falling, and the messengers that he sends out to gather the elect are the same supernatural aid that the gospel enjoys in all places where God's people proclaim it. The elect will be called from the four corners because it's a global mission now. That's the general flow in the main sense. When you take it that way, there's other things I think are striking incidentals, maybe not the selling points, I've listed them last, but the things that I think seem to fit. The word for vultures there in the Greek is also can be translated eagles, because the Greeks viewed eagles as a group part of the vulture family in verse 28. And so he talks about eagles circling. And when Rome comes against Jerusalem, the Roman standard is an eagle on the top of it. And so literally, Jerusalem gets circled by eagles right before its destruction. And they completely demolished Jerusalem to where it's no longer a city for over 100 years afterwards. It's just leveled and empty. Josephus records the blood flowed like rivers down the streets. And they burned the temple, and they bring these Roman standards that represent Caesar, who claims the title Son of God, whom they worship. And they come at least to the east gate of the temple, if not into it, depending who you read, and they offer pagan sacrifices to Caesar. They desecrate the holy place. The eagles circle around the corpse. The people of God flee, and the abomination of desolation comes in. To me, that's a historical account that fits the language. You can have some concerns. Is it the People say, well, it says it's the greatest tribulation ever, or what about the Holocaust? I mean, there's been some bad stuff that's happened since. But I think when he's talking about its significance in redemptive history, this move from the temple, and this God pulling back his providential protection over his people. They have been exiled many times, and God allows now Israel to be slaughtered in the rejection of him. And instead, points to the church and says, this is where my people will be. And the Jewish people are invited in through faith in the gospel. This shakes the whole world. This shakes the whole story. Everything they've known as Jewish, these disciples are Jewish people. Their whole world shakes with a persecution and a tribulation. I think the gravity and the historic significance is historically unparalleled. Even if the raw numbers of dead people and bloodshed, we've continued to see the world get bloodier and bloodier, last century being one of the bloodiest. So no, I'm not saying this is a body count tribulation, but the magnitude of the shift happening here as the temple is destroyed and the presence of God goes out into the church, instead of calling people to come to him through a sacrificial system, that comes in through a shaking and through a persecution and a tribulation. I'm fine reading it that way. Now, that much, I got tons of scholars all rolling together. Certainly, tons of scholars don't, but pretty solid consensus among a number of heavyweight theologians that that's a way to take it. The last bit, then even that group then parts out into groups, because he says immediately after that tribulation, we get this revelation of the Son of Man. And you can go two ways. Some of the guys go, this is the one part in here that's looking out into the future, the return of Jesus at the end of all time. The weakness for me is I feel like we just switched up our hermeneutic. We just did a whole bunch of heavy lifting to go ahead and say this generation means this generation. And then we said, psych, that one part's not this generation. And so You got some that'll say this is the final return. I'm going to join the crew that says we have a final return. This isn't talking about that. If you don't buy me there, you got good company. But here's my reasons. To say that this suddenly jumped to being about the final end, you have to deal with the word immediately. In verse 29, immediately after this great tribulation is when we get this revelation of the Son of Man. And what you're going to have to say is that immediately doesn't mean immediately in the most normal sense of right away next, but has to just mean immediately in the sense that there's no other big events, right? After this tribulation, destruction of the temple, the next big thing to happen is the return of Christ. That would be, if you're going to read that we jump to the end here, you got to stretch that immediately out, and that would be how you take it. There's plenty of good men who do. One of the commentaries I've enjoyed and used in a lot of my preaching studies for this series has been Craig Blomberg's commentary on Matthew, and he goes that way, taking this to be the end. Other theologians, Kenneth Gentry, N.T. Wright, would say there's more than one sense in which Jesus comes used in Scripture. N.T. Wright in particular says when you look at the Daniel prophecy, you get a sense not of a return of Christ, but a revelation of Christ in heaven. And he notes that in here, one, we've got the immediately, so he's looking for an event that he's seeing as tied to, like happening right with. So when this happens on earth, here's what's happening. Because he says the sign of the Son of Man coming, which is Greek word parousia, which means an appearing. Right? It can be appearing to come. The Romans used it that way when a governor came to a town. He was as appearing. But it's not always a coming. It's just an appearing. And he says that it's a sign in the heavens and that it's a coming or an appearing in the clouds, verse 30. He doesn't locate it on earth. We read that in to assume this is his return to earth. The disciples barely understood Jesus' death and resurrection, so it's not likely they were assuming he's coming back because they weren't quite ready to see him go yet. And so I'm more persuaded with that interpretation that this is that he's saying what you just saw on earth reveals something that's happening in heaven. And I'm going to pull back the curtain prophetically and show you what's happening in the clouds, in the heavens. This means that the appearing is talking about events in heaven, and that what we just saw on earth points to it and signifies it. And part of why I think this is because Jesus says in our passage that this is the fulfillment of Daniel 7. He does give us another passage. So while we could look at Revelation, we could look at Thessalonians, they're not written yet, so he's not referencing them. But he does reference Daniel. Daniel 7 seems to be the passage he's referring to. And in that passage, if I can sort of summarize the whole chapter, because there's a lot there, you can go check me later. Daniel sees, it starts with him seeing these various beasts that are gathering. And he makes it clear in the passage, they represent nations, and they're doing nation-y things. They got multiple horns, and the horns talk. And you know these referring to nations and their leaders. And these beasts are persecuting and trampling. And so beasts causing tribulation is a solid picture here for the beginning of Daniel that fits some of what we're seeing in Jesus' prophecy where nations come in a circle and destroy Israel. So the threatening beasts surrounding and gathering. But then he sees the second part of the vision, there's three parts, is he sees the Ancient of Days sitting in heaven on this fiery throne, judges the beasts. And so while the beasts look like they're winning, there's this vindication as this Ancient of Days pronounces judgment. And then the third part of the vision, he says, I see one like the Son of Man in the clouds. And this Son of Man is not going down to the beasts. He's being presented to the Ancient of Days. He's standing before the throne of the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days, God the Father in heaven, gives him a kingdom and a dominion that is an eternal kingdom and a global kingdom. That's the picture that Jesus invokes when he describes the destruction of the temple and then the Son of Man appearing in the clouds. And so theologians like N.T. Wright and others would point out that Daniel prophecy is not about the Son of Man's return to earth. It's about the Son of Man's presentation to the Father in heaven. It's his vindication that he has won the kingdom and given the authority and power. So what he accomplished on earth is now being vindicated in heaven. And the picture isn't there of him going down. Wright's other point in bolstering this is, and I love when theologians prove they can count, Daniel 6 comes before Daniel 7. Daniel 6 is the part of Daniel you all actually know. It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And Wright's argument and others would say that these stories actually run in a similar parallel. In the lion's den, Daniel, as the Lord's anointed, stands surrounded by the beasts that are gathering with sharp fangs and a threat. And yet God, supernaturally through his power, vindicates his chosen one by stopping the powers of the beasts so they cannot destroy. And then the king appears at the top of the den. He doesn't come down into the den, but he calls out and proclaims the victory of Daniel, and he then gives the kingdom. The next decree of the king is that the whole nation must worship Daniel's God. And so he says, look, there's this picture of the beasts gathered, the supernatural preservation and protection of God over his people and judgment of the beasts, and the revelation above them. And he says that kind of staging that you have in the chapter 6 is the same staging we get in chapter 7. Now in the visions, the lions aren't lions, they're the beasts of the nations. And the Ancient of Days appears as the king above and authoritatively decrees the victory and hands out the dominion from above. And so this language in the clouds, the appearing in glory, he says when you hear these ideas of the appearing in glory, the appearing in the clouds, that these speak not to Christ coming down to earth, but a revelation of what's happening with Christ in heaven. Jesus said, I will go up to my Father, and I'll be seated in power. In fact, so he's saying in the story, the king's appearing, it matches the church in Jesus' day, in that New Testament moving towards 70 AD, is vexed by persecuting rulers, both the religious rulers of that Jerusalem temple and the secular rulers of the Roman Empire by 70 AD are persecuting the church. They are the beasts, and they have encircled God's people. And those beasts, include all these who would oppose and even seek to crucify the Messiah. They follow the apostles with stonings and riots. There's this oppression, and it seems like the lions are going to get you. Between Nero and the temple leadership, the beasts and the lawlessness have risen up against God, but God conquers them, just as Daniel 7 says he would, and sits in judgment over them in heaven, taking away their position and giving it to the Son of Man. So the destruction of the temple is the sign on earth of the vindication of the Son of Man in heaven. It signifies that the kingdom has been taken from the Jewish leaders and given to Jesus. It signifies that Jesus is now building an eternal and global kingdom that will stretch to the ends of the earth. All nations have been given to him. The parallel of Daniel is the king giving a global and eternal kingdom to the Son, and in Matthew 24, it's the Son sending out the heralds of that message to the ends of the earth to tell the elect wherever they may be found. Because we're not looking at Jerusalem anymore. We suddenly look outward, and we look to the ends of the earth. This kingdom's going everywhere. Now, that's much I'm going to cover on the text. Whether you follow me and all that, and we're like, oh yeah, it makes sense, or you're like, this man has lost his way. I think the main points stand. And I got an extra week to restudy some of this, and I spent a lot of time listening to scholars who disagree with that reading. We are so much on the same page for as much as we disagree on. Because either way, we all agree that Jesus is coming back. Whether or not this passage is talking about it, later in Matthew 24 and 25, we are going to talk about it. So he's coming back. I think that this passage isn't talking about that yet. And that just means I'm more excited because I don't have much left for him to do before he gets back. I'm like, he can come. So we all believe he's coming back. I certainly don't believe less in that. You could argue I believe a little bit more in that because I got a short list. I just think... And we all believe that Jesus is victorious, right? Whichever way you go in your end times theology, I don't know of an end times position that says, and then Jesus loses. I think this passage proves he's victorious with this compelling, fulfilled prophecy. But the other guys don't think he isn't victorious just because they're waiting for a rebuilt temple and another destruction. We all should believe he's victorious. We believe that Jesus' death and resurrection is the pivotal moment in the history of the world. And that everything, every power and authority has changed because of it and after it. And so while I think I've got an event that marks it, now we'll get there, we're almost there. While I have this event where I'm going, here is the sign of the vindication and the enthronement of the Son of Man in heaven. It's not that the other camp doesn't think Jesus has that victory and that authority. And we believe Jesus' power accompanies the gospel mission in the world today. I think it's pictured in our passage, but that doesn't mean the other group doesn't think so. They think Jesus' power goes with his gospel. And so that's the point of everything I've said. That's the application of how I'm interpreting the passage. And this past week, since I couldn't do much else, I've listened to and read hours of commentary from various views. And while we differ on some of the events, all of them, we're agreed on the applications. So what do we do with the point of these passages? Because I said before, if end times doesn't change the way you live today, you're not preaching it right. If it's just crazy stories to make movies or scare tactics, or that's just abusing the passage. It's not what Jesus was doing. He's speaking to his disciples to help them obey him and follow him. So I'm actually just going to make 2 points because I spent a lot of time on the text. And I think these 2 points are the strongest and most important. First thing, what are we saying with this? This vindication and this picture of the messengers going out on the basis of the destroyed temple and the enthronement of Jesus. We're saying the gospel has power. That this global mission of taking the message of Jesus to the world is power. From the beginning of the passage, I think this is one of the motivational things that Jesus knew his disciples needed to have sink in. I mean, put yourself visually in the setting of this whole message. Can you imagine they're standing among these stone buildings? They're in the temple precinct. It seems like they're impressed and looking at these buildings because we've got a restored temple that's been recently updated. Herod and others have put money into this, and so they're going, look at these buildings, stone structures, foundations laid, walls. From where they're standing, it would have such a feeling of permanence. This place and what happens here will stand, will be consequential and influential. And Jesus says, yeah, I know it looks that way, but it's not. Within your generation, it's all going to be gone. These strong stones will be totally destroyed. You see, it's hard to believe God's power when you're impressed with human power. That's why you need to know the gospel's powerful and more powerful than the things you think are permanent and impressive. It seemed like the Jewish system with the temple and those that could wield the power of the temple would always be a powerful influence. That's what it would profoundly look like to him, but it wasn't true. See, when you think that way, you build your plans around it. You assume it into things. Jesus tells them that the math they've known their whole lives, the anchor that has been central to Israel's worship and identity for centuries, is about to be forever changed. They have to let go of it if they're going to believe and follow the power of Jesus. You can't cling to the powers and confidences that reject Jesus and follow him at the same time. The temple had to fall so the church could stand. It was a sign of his power. He said as much when he stood before the leadership. We'll see this in a couple chapters in Matthew 26:64 when he stands before the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the rulers of that temple. They throw false charges at him. He's silent. And he finally says, "But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Do you see how well that fits the way I'm reading this passage? And he didn't say, at a certain time you will see this. He says, from now on, this is where I will be. I am standing and seated in power beside the Father. And it's this picture of him in the clouds. From now on, he's challenging their power and authority. They may look like they're in charge because they sit in those big stone temple buildings that's always been there, and God seems to always redeem and allow them to rebuild. And he says, no, you will see the powers over here. You have nothing. From now on, Jesus sits in power, and he says to these men that they too would see it. Do you believe that Jesus has that kind of power? Do you believe that it's greater than our culture? greater than the things that seem so permanent and entrenched in our society, our lives, our family histories. What are those things that seem permanent to you? We can have such a pessimistic view of the hope of Christianity and the gospel in our country. Well, they're going secular. And we act like these resistances and these oppositions are permanent, as if Jesus doesn't have the power. What are those things that seem permanent to you but stand in the way of what Jesus wants to do? From now on, you need to see Jesus in power. If I can illustrate it this way, one of the areas where this has hit home for me, in the drama ministry, where I get to work with in discipleship, one of the things we deliberately do in our discipleship is we want the kids to learn how to share the gospel verbally. I know it's a bait and switch. They join a mime team, and then we teach them to talk. And it would be bait and switch if it wasn't for it. We tell them, so it's not really a secret. But see, initially, when they're going to come, they're going to learn how to mime and share the gospel that way. And then it might be me or one of the other directors who verbally shares the gospel at the outreaches. But we don't leave it there. I don't want their discipleship to lead them to think that they need anyone else for sharing the gospel. It can be really tempting to think, oh, my job is to get people to hear the really powerful gospel ministers. I got to get them to hear my pastor, get them to hear my director. I get them to that big name speaker who's having a rally because we think the power is in the person. And so they might be tempted, well, Tim says it so well, and that's why the outreaches go well. And if I leave them with that view, I've failed in discipling them for Jesus' mission. So we train them to share, and then our directors deliberately plan to skip outreaches. There are outreaches I didn't go to, and I was free that evening. We step back so that they will know the power wasn't us, because it's not. And it's such a beautiful thing when you see that light bulb go on. When I get to sit with some kids after an outreach that I skipped, and they talk about how they saw God's Spirit move on people's hearts. When a whole bunch of teenagers who know they're not up for it shared the gospel, and the gospel moved in power, they realize you don't need Tim. You just need the gospel. And so when that light bulb goes on, when it clicks, and you get to hear these testimonies of the years where that person gets it, the gospel is the power. Your pastors, your directors, your favorite speakers, we're just cheerleaders. God is doing the work. And you need to see that if you're going to have a witness of your own. And so for us, sorry, that was the next slide with the drama logo. You can go to the next one. I forget that I have slides for each of these. Confidence in sharing Jesus with people should come from a belief that Jesus' power goes with you, not a confidence in your own strength. You don't witness because you think you're good enough. You witness because you think Jesus has got this. See, maybe you think the idea of you speaking up with a neighbor or a friend about Jesus would take a miracle. I've heard people tell me that. Boy, do I have good news for you. Miracles are on the table. He blew up a temple. Whatever you were thinking you need to make this happen is small fries. He sent out his messengers. They go with you. He toppled the persecuting empire. Trust that the gospel is, in itself, by Jesus' decree, the power of God unto salvation. You just need to be obedient. He will be sufficient. Who are those people in your life that God is asking you to share the gospel with? There have to be people, whether that's neighbors, acquaintances, but I want you to think and put names on it right now. Who are those people you come in contact with that you don't know where they stand before God? Who are they? Purpose to obey, trusting in Jesus' power to take it from there. He's sufficient to reach them. Second point, last point, I think goes right along with it. The gospel has authority. Not only is it sufficiently powerful to take us and use us to reach people, but this picture of the vindication is about the authority of Jesus. See, there's another obstacle that gets in the way of us obeying Jesus' global mission. And I think this hits strong, especially in our current culture, because we're a culture of everybody minding their own business. We're a culture that demands everybody's views is given equal credence, right? In a pluralistic society like ours, we can struggle to feel like it's appropriate to share Jesus with people. We get feeling really stuck and guilty as Christians because we know we're supposed to share with people, but we never feel like we can, or we should, but we shouldn't. Am I allowed? This is honestly not a new struggle. It's not unlike what the Christians in the Roman Empire would have experienced. Christianity literally becomes illegal. Caesar claims the title of Son of God. He demands that all people worship him and the Roman pantheon. I mean, it's more overt there than today. But you could understand if a Roman Christian felt like they didn't have the authority to proclaim Christ just about anywhere. I'm not allowed to talk about Jesus in the marketplace. Rome's there. I'm not allowed to talk about Jesus at the pagan temples. Those are the legal enshrined ones. They would have felt like, no, you're not allowed to do this anywhere. They were told as much. But the Christians had the audacity to believe that Jesus was king, even if Caesar disagreed. They believed Jesus' authority was above every earthly power, that he had been given a global kingdom from the Ancient of Days, and Caesar got no claim on that. They believed that Jesus laid claim to all people in every place. So look, there might be times where it makes strategic sense to share or not share one place or another, but that's not the same thing as us accepting any earthly authority as having dominion over our witness. I don't not share somewhere because the president told me not to. I share or I don't share out of obedience to Jesus. You have a right before God to share Jesus with people, with everyone, everywhere. When you can do so peaceably without cost, great. Thank God for his favor. But even when you can't, you obey anyway. I said this a few weeks back. If you're waiting for the right time to share Jesus with someone, you probably never will. And what I'm getting at is just that we tend to set up all of these conditions for sharing. And don't get me wrong, I get it. I plan outreaches. And in those planning, we talk about ideal settings, best ways to share, cultural relevance, and all of that stuff. And I'm not against that per se. But those are factors in deciding how to share, not if. When you let those things be the decision, when you let them decide if you will share, you let factors beyond the authority of Jesus make the decision. The decision has been made. When Jesus stood before the chief priests, he said, "There will be a sign of my authority." Then we received the sign. It's go time, friends. You have your orders. You don't have to question it. We wrestle with this. At one point I was getting ready to go on a mission trip to Bogota, Colombia with drama in South America. I posted on Facebook that we were heading out asking for folks to pray for us. And a relative of mine, who's not a big fan of organized religion, commented on my post. And he said something to the fact of that I need to respect the faith of the people of the land because it's their turf. And I think that's a pretty mainstream view. What right do I have as some American white dude to waltz down to Bogota and tell them what they need? I think that resonates with our culture. Who do I think I am? I'm nobody. I'm not going down there because I think I'm somebody. I don't go on my own authority. And if I bring them a bunch of baggage of American culture, that's not what this call is about. This doesn't justify that one bit. But I can tell you, when we shared the message of Jesus in a little squatter village on the fringes of the capital city, they didn't care who I was either. We asked them if they knew about Jesus, and they said, "No, please tell us." I'm not used to people talking back in our outreaches. It's a moving moment when you realize they don't know who Jesus is, and they just want to hear it. The Colombian police escorted us because they wanted to assist us in taking the gospel into those villages. Doesn't sound like I'm an unwelcome and white intruder. This is not about me. This is the power of the gospel kicking down doors. People came forward to pray because they heard about a Savior who died that they might be forgiven. They responded to Jesus. We were just messengers. It's not about my turf or your turf. There is no turf. It's all about Jesus. All authority in heaven and earth belongs to him. Jesus belongs everywhere. There is no place that he should not be claimed as their Lord and their Savior. So we've got to see the authority of the gospel, or we're going to think there's places we can't go, people we can't talk to. And so for us, this authority thing has to hit home. You need to remind yourself of Jesus' authority. Those names that I'm hoping Jesus put on your heart earlier when I asked you, who are you in contact with that you don't know where they stand before the Lord? I want you to remember that Jesus commands that they hear his gospel. He's authoritatively sent out his messengers. Our prayer needs to be, here am I, Lord, send me. Would you pray for those people? And in your prayer, I dare you to tell God that you are willing to be sent to them. Ask him to do it. You'll be asking him to do what I know he wants to do. That's the most powerful kind of praying there is. When you pray in agreement with Jesus' authority, you don't have to wonder what God's answer is. You might not know how he's going to say yes, but you know it's his answer. God wants them to hear the gospel. He has decreed that they hear the gospel. You're just offering that he might use you to do it. Pray like that, and I think you'll begin to see the Son of Man sitting in power in the clouds, enthroned in heaven. I've seen him kick down doors in ways that I know I didn't have the power or authority to do. When you get on board with the authority of Jesus, you stand under the vindicated King. You'll see his power and reign on earth as it is in heaven. That's what I think our passage is about. The vindicated mission. Jesus has been given power and dominion over the whole world, and he sends out his gospel message in that power. We are to boldly and obediently call people to Jesus. So that's the last slide. I'm going to give you 2 discussion questions, or statements. They're not really questions. 1, I'd love you to take a moment and just share some stories where you saw God's power at work in bringing people to the gospel. When I looked at this picture of what God did in 70 AD with the temple, I was just moved by the testimony and the reminder, well, you have a powerful God. It means business with this gospel work, with the message of Jesus going out. It's good to hear the stories. And so we'll let you share some stories. 2, if you're willing, if some people's names came to your mind earlier, I'd like to boldly ask that you share who some of those people you may be called to witness to are. And then pair up with somebody here in the room and pray for each other. You pray for them, that they would be sent by God and used by God to share his gospel to those people, and they pray the same for you with whoever you shared. That's us just putting ourselves under the authority and power of Jesus.